For centuries, Ukraine has been known as the breadbasket of Europe. This title is entirely accurate given that Ukraine is home to around a quarter of the world's super-fertile Chernozem or black soil. So Ukraine is an agricultural superpower. The untapped potential of Ukraine's agricultural sector is staggering. The country boasts around 42 million hectares of agricultural land. At present, 32 million hectares are cultivated annually, representing an area larger than Italy. Given the size and fertility of the country's farmland, together with its large scope for increased harvests, Ukraine could literally feed the world. However, it is said that the Ukrainian grain was used as a strategic weapon against the Ukrainian people in the 1930s and 1940s. Holodomor, also known as the Terror Famine or Great Famine, was a man-made famine in the Soviet Union from 1932 to 1933 that killed millions of Ukrainians. The Holodomor was part of the wider Soviet famine of 1932, which affected the major grain-producing areas of the country. While scholars universally agree that the cause of the famine was man-made, whether the Holodomor constitutes a genocide remains in dispute. Some historians conclude that the famine was actually planned by Joseph Stalin in order to eliminate the Ukrainian independence movement. Others suggest that it simply arose because of rapid Soviet industrialization and collectivization of the agriculture. Ukraine was one of the largest grain-producing states in the Soviet Union, and as a result was hit particularly hard by the famine. Early estimates of the death toll by scholars and government officials differ greatly, but a joint statement of the United Nations declared that 7 to 10 million people died. The famine, widespread impact on Ukrainians persists to this day. Nazi Germany had also long-term plans with the Ukrainian grain. The grain surplus of Ukraine figured particularly prominently in the vision of a self-sufficient Germany. Hitler himself had stated in August of 1939 that Germany needed the Ukraine in order that no one is able to starve us again as in the last war. Operation Hunger Plan was a partially implemented economic management scheme developed by German bureaucrats to seize food from the Soviet Union, mainly grain from Ukraine, and give it to the German soldiers and civilians. The plan entailed the genocide by starvation of millions of Soviet citizens following Operation Barbarossa, the 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union. The premise behind the hunger plan was that Germany was not self-sufficient in food supplies. To sustain the war and keep up domestic morale, it needed food from the conquered lands at any cost. The plan created a famine as an act of policy, killing millions. The architect of the hunger plan was Herbert Backe, a German politician and SS general who served as state secretary and minister in Germany's Ministry of Food and Agriculture. Together with others, including Heinrich Himmler, Backe led a coalition of Nazi politicians dedicated to securing Germany's food supply. The hunger plan may have been decided on almost as soon as Hitler announced his intentions to invade the Soviet Union in December of 1940. Certainly, by May of 1941, it was in the advanced stages of planning and was ready for discussion between all the major state ministries and the German Army High Command. The lack of capacity of the Russian railways, the inadequacy of road transport, and the shortages of fuel meant that the German army would have to feed itself by living off the land in the territories they conquered in the western regions of the Soviet Union. A meeting in May of 1941 between the secretaries responsible for logistical planning for the invasion and military officials included the following conclusion: the war can only be continued if the entire German army is freed from Russia in the third year of the war. If the German army takes what it needs out of the country, there can be no doubt that tens of millions of Soviet people will die of starvation. A minutes of the meeting presents the decision on the life or death of large parts of the local population as a logical, inevitable development. Discussing the plan, Backe noted a surplus population in Russia of 20 to 30 million. If that population were cut off from food, it could be used for the invading German army and the German population. So a carefully planned starvation was to be an integral part of the German campaign, and the German planners believed that the assault on the Soviet Union could not succeed without it. German agricultural officials saw the hunger plan as a solution to the European food crisis and a method for exterminating the undesirable Soviet population. The hunger plan caused the death of millions of citizens in German-occupied territories of the Soviet Union. According to the estimates, 4.2 million Soviet citizens, mainly Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians, were starved by the German occupiers between 1941 and 1944. The most reliable figures for the death rate among Soviet prisoners of war in German captivity reveal that 3.0 million died of total of 5.7 million captured between June of 1941 and February of 1945. Most of them directly or indirectly from starvation. Of these 3.3 million, 2 million had already died by the beginning of February of 1942. The enormous number of deaths was the result of a deliberate policy of starvation directed against Soviet prisoners of war. In spite of the exorbitantly high death rate among Soviet POWs, who constituted the main group of victims of the hunger plan, the plan was never fully implemented due to the failure of the German military campaign. The reason is that the German army simply lacked the manpower to enforce a food blockade of the Soviet cities, neither could they confiscate the food. But the Germans were able to significantly supplement their grain stocks, particularly from the Ukraine, and cut off the Soviets from them. In 1942 and 43, occupied Soviet Union supplied Germany with more than 20% of its grain, 25% of its fats, and 30% of its meat.